Good evening, and welcome to the 50th anniversary of the Joint Center. I am honored to join Majority Whip James Clyburn as we discuss the legacy of the Joint Center and talk about three truly giants and American patriots, Eddie Williams, Representative John Lewis, and Representative Elijah Cummings. We could not think of a better person to have this virtual fireside chat on the last evening of this wonderful occasion than Majority Whip James Clyburn. He has served with distinction in the US Congress since 1993 and surely made sure that all of our voices were heard in the last election. And I just want to take a moment to personally thank Majority Whip Clyburn for his mentorship of me and his close relationship with these three giants that we'll speak of today. And so I will now ask Representative Clyburn to share his initial thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Vincent, and thanks to all of you who are tuning in this evening to share this anniversary with us. I was wondering when I first received the invitation to be here with you this evening, exactly why it is that I'm one of the ones that you invited. Well, now I know. It is very clear that you were looking for someone who was old enough to have spanned the lives and legacies of these three distinguished gentlemen. I first met Eddie Williams when he came to the Joint Center back in 1972, if my memory serves. In fact, I had already had a relationship with the Joint Center. I knew Frank Reeves and Clarence Towns. I worked with them pretty closely. Frank Reeves, we always considered to be the Democrat in the group, and of course, Clarence Towns was a Republican. And the work was always to try to make this Joint Center, then for political studies, is now political and economic studies, to make it a bipartisan group so that we could call upon the leadership, political leadership of both Black and white, as well as the Democrats and Republicans. And of course, I knew John Lewis even a little longer. I first met John in 1960. John and I were founding members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, commonly known as SNCC. And of course, we worked together through the, after he left SNCC, was kind of pushed out of SNCC, as many people may recall. John began to work with the Southern Regional Council, the Voter Education Project. And I was doing that down in Charleston, the Charleston kind of Voter Education Project. And so John and I forged a very close relationship. They continued all the way up to his death a few months ago. And of course, Elijah Cummings was just a great friend. Elijah and I shared South Carolina soil. His parents were raised in Clarendon County, where Brown v. Board of Education started. And they moved up to Baltimore. And of course, Elijah was born in Baltimore. But when he got elected to Congress, I had a big homecoming for him at Mount Zero Baptist Church. And these three gentlemen and I had a very, very close relationship politically. And it was my great honor to speak at the homegoing service of Eddie Williams at his wife's invitation. And I also spoke at the memorial service we had there in Cedric Hall for Elijah Cummings, and of course attended down in Atlanta the homegoing service of John Lewis. So I suspect that's why I'm here, because I had such a close relationship with all three of these gentlemen, and I'll be pleased as the evening goes on to say more about them as we have this discussion. So as we say on the floor of the House, Dr. Vincent, I'll yield back.
Majority Whip Clyburn, thank you so much for that relationship. It is relationships, as you know, are so important, and we need to remind everyone that this is not a new phenomena, but something that has been going on for decades. And indeed, I want to give a even greater historical context. I believe one of the great narratives in American history is the fight to ensure that all persons, and particularly African Americans, can fully participate in our democratic society, and that's most manifested in the right to vote. We saw that during Reconstruction, there was the beginning of that, and then, of course, the violent retrenchment of those rights and the continued fight. You were so important in that. Of course, Representative Lewis and so many others, young people who were involved in that. And that fight culminated in the passage of the 1965 Voters' Rights Act. And of course, that ensured that more African-American elected officials at the local, state, and federal level emerged. That also culminated in the first African-American president and President Barack Obama. But then still, retrenchment occurs. And this push and pull is something that has been so critical. And you've been at the forefront of these issues, as have these three distinguished gentlemen that we're speaking of today. And of course, Eddie Williams founding this think tank that has been a source of information and for us as we continue to fight for equity and justice. And you began to talk about this impact of these three individuals. What I will share was, first of all, what great men they were. They certainly were great public figures, but what I believe anyone who met these three men knew was that they were gentlemen. As a young person, what I appreciated about all three was how generous they were with their time. And it was so inspiring to see that they were willing to do that. They also effectively served as a moral compass. I will remember when Representative Cummings spoke to the people, certainly to the House, but to the people, that we can do better than this. I remember what Representative Lewis said right before he passed, inspiring young people, and certainly giving his energy to the young people and empower him, just like you all did in 1960, that this is not an old person's movement, this is a young person's movement, and we did that. And so I would like you to share the impact of the, and not just the loss, but the legacy. What does it mean today, in the middle of these twin pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism? What is the impact and legacy of these three individuals?
Well, as you know, Eddie Williams was professionally a journalist, having worked, if my memory serves, both in Atlanta and in Chicago, centers of political activity in the South and political activity in the North. I remember very well the board, the original board of the Joint Center. One of the people who was responsible was Louis Martin, who I knew very well. And Louis was a publisher in Chicago. And of course, I suspect he and Eddie knew each other well. So when the Joint Center, having been founded in 1970, began to flounder, Frank Reeves, the original executive director, I guess, became ill. His health was not good. And of course, it was floundering. They turned to Eddie Williams and brought Eddie to Washington. And Eddie reached out to young people all over the country. And we would often interact with him. He envisioned the Joint Center as being a think tank, really, on the order of, I guess, the Brookings Institute or something of that sort. And he worked hard to make it that, which meant that there is much more to the political process than just running for office. And that's what drove him to help people get prepared to run for office. To me, that would be his legacy. Now, if you look at John Lewis, who always would say, never give up, never give out, and never give in. John and I really enjoyed that close relationship. And our wives, we both married professional librarians. And our wives became good friends as well. And so John was really the moral conscience of the House of Representatives. He had endured so much. You mentioned the 1965 Voters' Rights Act. Now that was passed, as you know, about 6 months after John nearly lost his life on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I believe it was March 7th, 1965. And 6 months later, you had the President of the United States going before a joint session of the Congress and closing his speech with the mantra of the Civil Rights Movement, "We shall overcome." So John became sort of the symbol of all of that. But ironically, about a year, less than a year after the 1965 Voters' Rights Act, John was ousted from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, largely because he refused to adopt a mantra that was prevalent at the time, "Burn, baby, burn." John denounced that approach and was ousted from SNCC, but he never gave up on his internalization of nonviolence. I tell people all the time that most of us in the movement adopted nonviolence as a tactic, but John Lewis internalized it. It became a way of life for him. And he never met a young person that he did not give time to. When I say a young person, not just if you're in your 20s or 30s, you could be in your pre-teen years, and John would stop and give you the time that he thought you were deserving of. That's just the way that John was. And Elijah, you mentioned his mantra, "We are better than this." He always felt that irrespective of what was going on, the goodness of the American people had to shine through. He just felt that sincerely, no matter how controversial the issue, no matter how loud the opponents may have been, he always believed in the fundamental goodness. Remind me so much of that phrase that a lot of people give Alexis de Tocqueville credit for, though some historians said de Tocqueville never said it, that America is great because its people are good. And if the people of America ever cease to be good, America will cease to be great. That's what Cummings just embodied. And I would not be chairing, I'm sure, this committee that I now chair on COVID-19 if he were still with us. He probably, in fact, not probably, he would definitely be chairing this subcommittee, this special select subcommittee today. And I know that's the only reason Nancy Pelosi appointed me, because she didn't have Elijah Cummings anymore to give that responsibility to. And I think about him daily. Both of those guys, John and Elijah, were just great people to interact with. And I just wish that everybody listening tonight could have had the kind of relationship with them that I had.
Thank you. I wanted to connect the dot that brings us to another distinguished member of the legislative branch, and that's now Vice President elect Kamala Harris. And the four of you, the five of you have something in common. You are all distinguished members of historically Black colleges and universities. And Majority Whip Clyburn, can you speak to the power of HBCUs and what it meant to you and to your fellow legislators?
You know, I think that the best way to tell you what HBCUs mean is to share with you the last conversation I had with Ron McNair. Ron McNair, just before he went up in the Challenger, which turned out to be his fatal flight, it was going to be his last flight, he was here in Columbia, came by to visit with me after being interviewed at the University of South Carolina to become a professor there after he returned from space on this flight. He came by my office and he said to me on that occasion, he said, every time I'm introduced, people introduce me as having this PhD in physics from, I guess it was what, MIT, Tufts, MIT, I believe. He said, but that's not what made me who I am today. He said, what made me who I am today is North Carolina A&T. He said, when I left that little Lake City, South Carolina, where I was not allowed to use the library, and got to North Carolina A&T, it was those teachers, those small classes, those teachers who had the same kind of background and experiences that I grew up in. They are the ones that prepared me. And I was telling this story to Dr. Clark, who is now the president of South Carolina State University, and he was a classmate of Ron McNair at MIT. He said to me, he said, I never heard that story before, but I can tell you this. Ron McNair was the most prepared student among us at MIT. That's what these HBCUs are all about. They take people whose backgrounds and experiences may be on the Sea Islands of Georgia, Florida, North and South Carolina, may be in areas of overcrowded schools and underfunded schools. And when they get to these college campuses, they need special attention. In fact, I have one cardiologist said to me, a good friend of mine, David Dowdy, you may know, he's a graduate of North Carolina A&T. David Dowdy was one of the most successful cardiologists in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he heard me tell the story about Ron McNair one day, and he came up to me afterwards. He said, when I left Little Weber High School in Eastover, South Carolina, and got up to A&T, I thought I knew something. I had to take remedial everything. But he turned out to be a very successful cardiologist. So that, to me, is what the HBCU is all about. They take people who are what we might call diamonds in the rough, and they turn them in to great productive students simply because on those campuses and among those professors are people who have the kinds of backgrounds and kinds of experiences and can see the world through their eyes and can help them using their experiences and help them not just to challenge, but to overcome. And so that's what HBCU is. We can talk about it in all kinds of terms, but if you really want to get to what's fundamental about it, that's what it is. Being able to take those experiences, take those students where they are and help them to get to where they need to be, rather than being a number in a classroom with 250 students, as two of my two oldest daughters did. They were able to survive, but my youngest daughter was not. And therefore, after a year of that experience, I sent her to an HBCU, and she thrives today. In fact, just got elected the leading vote getter to the school board here in Columbia, South Carolina. That's what HBCUs are all about.
Thank you so much for that. Another important part of the American story is the genius of our foremothers and forefathers who created enduring institutions. Of course, we just now talked about historically Black colleges. I would add as you mentioned earlier, the Black press, the Black church, fraternities and sororities, including our fraternity of the BOULE. And of course, a central part of those enduring institutions that advocated for our permanent interests is the Joint Center. That, again, since the inception of these Civil Rights Acts, really recorded the history and the success of elected officials. You just mentioned your daughter. My mother served on the community school board in New York City. She was elected just 4 years after the Civil Rights Act. And as you know, back in '69, there was only about 1,400 elected officials. And every year, one of the real joys is when the annual report came home, the book got bigger, right, and bigger, right? And
absolutely.
We see that in even elections at the highest level. What stories, as an elected official, and if you can share stories from Representatives Cummings and Lewis, and your own stories and other legislators about your connection with the Joint Center and how it helped you become a more effective legislator and representative, not just for your district, but for the country.
You know, the Joint Center played a very significant role in my political life. I first ran for office in 1970. At the time it was being found, I was there in Charleston, South Carolina, and I won the Democratic primary, which was held in August that year, only to lose the general election. But right after losing general election, during the Christmas holidays, I received a phone call from a friend of mine who I grew up with over in Sumter. He was up in Chicago at a meeting that had been called by Louis Martin and others and said to me, I'd just been appointed to the governor's staff. And they said, no, there's nobody in this country, no Black person on the governor's staff. These people would like to see who you are. Can you come up here? The next day I got on the plane and went up to Chicago. And that was my introduction to those people who made up the board of the Joint Center. And of course, 2 years later, Eddie Williams became the CEO of it. Well, they helped me understand the political process in a way that I didn't before. I had run a campaign for city councilman. I had run myself, but the kind of ins and outs of politics, I didn't know that well. And I attribute a lot of that to the Joint Center. And just before, this director before Overton, we had a very good friend, Ralph Everett, at the Joint Center. So even after I've been in the Congress, I find myself continuing that interaction with the Joint Center and spent time. In fact, I just had him on my podcast because I think that there's so much to share. And it's more important today than it was then, because a lot of retrenchment is taking place. And I'm reminded almost daily of George Santayana's admonition that if we fail to learn the lessons of history, we're bound to repeat them. And we know from our experiences of the last 4 years that there are some history lessons that we are going to repeat, experiences that we're going to repeat if we have not learned those lessons. And I cannot think of a better place for all of that to take place than at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, because it is very important today that we take steps that are necessary to close these gaps that exist between the Blacks and whites. We just saw a study released yesterday that over the last 4 years, the wealth gap has gotten wider between blacks and whites. So if there's ever been a time for a think tank, for a center of political and economic studies, it is today, because we have got to call upon our history to make sure that we've got people who can understand those lessons and impart those lessons and prepare the next generation for leadership the way I needed to be prepared back in the early 1970s. So I think it is very critical today for us to take a look at the political world, if you please, and begin to look at young people, some are getting elected to office, some who need to get elected to office. I think it's very critical that that takes place.
I couldn't agree with you more. And we are so fortunate to have Spencer Overton as the executive director to continue that legacy and the work he's doing in diversifying the Congress, or the staff of the Congress, for example, and the future of work. Those initiatives are so absolutely critical. So we know that John Lewis spoke to young people during the murder of George Floyd and helping inspire this next generation. First, what would you say to young people? We know that you are such an inspiration to so many, and then reflect on what you know your brothers, Eddie Williams, Elijah Cummings, and John Lewis. What would they say to young people now that we've had an election, and what do we need to do to move forward?
You know, I remember when I won that primary back in 1970, and no blacks were serving in the General Assembly here in South Carolina at that time. That was a history-making event, and there was this big party. And that night after the results came in, and I noticed my wife was not participating in the party like everybody else was, and I was concerned about that. So on the way home, I asked her what was wrong. She told me nothing was wrong. She was okay, but I was afraid to, question her more. But the next morning, I got up, I walked into my bathroom. There was a little note she had placed on the mirror in my bathroom, and it said this: "When you win, brag gently. When you lose, weep softly." I never have forgotten that. And of course, I had to weep softly that following November. She saw what I did not see. And that's why we have to get people together, people who are out on the front lines, people who may be putting themselves out for office. But there's always somebody observing, and somebody who may see things a little bit differently. And all these two things need to come together. And that's why having a think tank like this is so important. People who may never run for office, but who may have studied these issues, may have observed things. My wife used to go to church with a notepad and a pen in her hand all day, not to take notes of the sermon, but to take notes of what she was observing in the pews of the church. And we would get back home sometimes, and she would share with me her observations, and would say to me, "Mr. So-and-so is somebody I think you need to talk to. There's something that I don't know what it is, but you need to talk to her." These kinds of things are so important. And I think that you do that when you can keep the lines of communication open. John was so good at that. Elijah, I used to talk to Elijah off the floor a lot. And he would say to me little things like my wife would say that he'd observed. And I had those kinds of relationships with John as well. So I think that we have got to take a look today and see whether or not we can reopen the lines of communication, because I think that living in a soundbite world, and that's what we're in now, we can get off kilter so quickly if we allow a 15-second or even 10-second soundbite to cloud your vision for the future. So I think it's important today, that those lines of communication that I see a little bit frayed, that we bring those things back into focus, because we are going to have some challenges going forward that we thought were behind us. Supreme Court, 8 years ago, eviscerated the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And this past election, the first election that we've had without the protection of the Voting Rights Act. That's why you've seen so much foolishness going on out here, because those protections we don't have anymore. You couldn't move a precinct without getting authorization from the Justice Department until the Supreme Court got rid of that 7 years ago. So now we see elections, we have these long, drawn-out controversies that you would not have had with the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So that act is important, not just to Black people, but it's important to keep our electoral process moving forward. So there's so much that we need to do. And every now and then we got to recognize that our society goes right for a while, then it goes back left, then it goes back right again. It went left with the election of Barack Obama. It went right with the election of 45. Now it's on its way back to the left with the recent election of Joe Biden. The question is, how long will it stay on that movement? Will it go left center, right center, or will we go over the edge as we almost did over the last 4 years? I really believe this election was all about maintaining the goodness of America. It was about continuing that pursuit of a more perfect union. It's a pursuit that we almost got distracted from. Hopefully, we're back on track to continue that pursuit. It's not perfect. No, it's not perfect. It will never be perfect. But we should always be in pursuit of perfection.
Well, this is a good opportunity for me to say two things. One, a personal thank you to you. In my time as grandsire, and of course, Eddie Williams served as the grandsire for the BOULE. You were so generous with your time. You always were available when I needed to touch base with you. You are a loyal part of that organization, and we thank you. I also want to thank you for the public for playing such an outsized role in our democracy. My goal is not to be partisan, but I felt like you played such an outsized role because of your gravitas in helping us stay focused on democracy, no matter what your political affiliation. So on behalf of all Americans, I want to thank you for your leadership and using your gravitas to get us back on track. And with that, a majority of Clyburn, we have about 50 days to the transition. What are the priorities and how can the Joint Center help execute and advance and meet those priorities?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I think it is very, very important for us to really take a hard look at where we are as a country today. To begin with, COVID-19 has got to be confronted in such a way that we can overcome this, hopefully, within the next 12 months. We now have 2 and maybe 3 vaccines that are going to be available. Now, in my duties with the select subcommittee, part of my responsibility is oversight of how our money is spent and how it is used by those people who get it. And one of the things that's going to be very, very important is going to be when there is a vaccine, and there will be within months now, how will they get distributed? We will have the same kind of experience with this vaccine that we had, say, with the polio vaccine. You know, we had 2 polio vaccines. You may not be too young to remember this, but I do remember the Salk vaccine and the Sabin vaccine. Now, the Salk vaccine was a shot in the arm. The saving vaccine was a little drop of serum on a lump of sugar. So I need not tell you who got the shots and who got the lump of sugar. So part of my job is going to be when these vaccines are available. We already know there's a big difference in them. One vaccine that's coming on board can be preserved at ordinary temperatures. The other one's going to have to be some astronomically low, astronomical probably the wrong word for being low, in temperature for it to be preserved. And what gets to the rural areas? How do you get that to the rural areas? So it's going to be a big job for us. But second to that is going to be, what do we do about this economy? What do we do about the social order? I've already said to the people in this transition that we need to put together an effort to take a hard look at the 1986 and 1988 and 1994 crime bills, to look at the unintended consequences that flowed from those bills and what we can do right away to correct some of that. Because we now got people sitting in prisons all over this country, serving time for doing what the people of Colorado make a living off of legally, and other states as well. So we've got to take a look at that in order to help get things back on track. And then I just believe that we got to treat broadband deployment today like we treated electricity in the middle of the 20th century. I'm sincere when I say that the key to having the efficient and effective delivery of healthcare is broadband. Having adequate education is broadband. Doing what is necessary to close the rural-urban divide is broadband. So I just think that broadband is got to be treated in any infrastructure bill the way we treated electricity before. If you remember when the internet first came out, we used to call it the information highway. So let's treat the information highway the same way we treat the interstate highway. And I think we'll do a whole lot about bringing things together. So if this is going to be a successful administration, we are going to have to do something in those three areas as far as I'm concerned.
Majority Republican, as we close out, I want to thank you for invoking the spirit of Eddie Williams and Representatives Lewis and Cummings, and continuing their work and legacy through your leadership and through your service. I also want to thank our fellow brothers, our fellow ARCHONS. Through their philanthropic support, we were able to be a sponsor of this 50th celebration to celebrate both our past grandsire, Eddie Williams, and the outstanding work of the Joint Center and the partnership between Sigma Pi Phi and the Joint Center. So I'm just so very pleased that we were able to do that. And to close out, I want the last voice to be yours to make any concluding remarks you would as we close out this virtual fireside chat.
Well, thank you very much for that, and thank you, Grandsire Archon. Let me say this. I think that no matter how we may think about the complications going forward, there's something that's fundamental that you get out of Gullah Geechee country. I think you propagate it everywhere. And there's a saying that I used to share with young people that you get from your grandparents. If at first you don't succeed, try and try again. There's no numerical limit on how many times you ought to try. I lost 3 times before I got elected to office. I got elected the first time I ran for Congress, but I ran statewide here in South Carolina twice and lost after running for the House. And a friend of mine asked me after that third loss, what are you going to do now? You know what they say, 3 strikes and you're out. And I said to my friend, that's a baseball rule. And nobody should live their lives by baseball rules. We should live our lives by those fundamentals that we got from our grandparents. You keep trying till you get it right. This country is a country worth saving. This democracy is a very tenuous one. And each and every one of us has got a stake in it. And some of us have got a stake that sometimes put our forebears under at intense trials and tribulations. But we got a stake in it. It is ours as much as anybody's. We must participate in it. We must stay focused. We must never give up, never give out, and never give in. That's as John Lewis would want it.
Good evening. I'm Geraldine Williams, and for almost 35 years I was married to Eddie Williams. So I saw firsthand for a very long time how much love and energy he poured into building the Joint Center into what it is today. Spencer, I'd like to congratulate and thank you for your leadership. As this entire event demonstrates, this organization is in great hands with you at the helm. Thank you to the entire Joint Center team for carrying on the vision and the tradition of this great organization. And Congressman Clyburn and Professor Vincent, thank you so much for your touching tribute to Eddie's legacy and to the legacies of two leaders he admired, John Lewis and Elijah Cummings. I, as much as anyone else, would have loved to be in person celebrating this great organization tonight. We've all had to make sacrifices and be creative, but this has been a year none of us could have predicted and even wanted. But one thing has emerged from all of this that is a renewed sense of civic engagement. I know Eddie would have been so proud of the record turnout in this year's elections. He always stressed that one of the most important things we can do, particularly as Black people, is to participate in the civic process. Regardless of whom we choose to vote for, the single most important thing we can do is vote and make our voices heard. And he would have been so proud of the turnout, the record turnout, record Black turnout in the 2020 elections. Some of the challenges we face today are some of the same ones that were core to the Joint Center's work back in 1972 when Eddie started at the center. Improving education, closing the racial wealth gap, keeping Black businesses open and Black families afloat. Only now they are compounded by COVID-19, where Black businesses and Black families have been some of the hardest hit. With this all in mind, I know Eddie would have been particularly thrilled to see the program that the Joint Center has put on this week. Everything we have seen has been emblematic of an organization that is at the forefront of breaking down policy barriers and ensuring that Black people can enjoy full freedom in America. And I know Eddie would have been so proud of all we have accomplished. But he would also be the first to say that our work is not done. Congratulations to the Joint Center on its 50th anniversary. I can't wait to see what the next 50 years will bring. Good night.
The Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies really is rooted in the lived experience of Black people around this country. There are a plethora of think tank organizations around the US, but they're not led by a Black board, by a prominent Black staff. And that is Black focused, meaning its mission is to uplift Black people.
The Joint Center plays a unique role with its origins coming out of the civil rights movement.
From the beginning, activists were moving into positions of influence in terms of being elected for the first time as a result of the Voting Rights Act when the Joint Center was founded in 1970.
It's important that an entity was created like the Joint Center to keep a record of the degree of involvement and engagement of Black Americans in the electoral process, the extent to which Black Americans are represented in Congress in particular, but also at the state legislative levels.
It's been a source of information, especially for the Congressional Black Caucus. It's been an important source of communication. And one of the consistencies has been the convening power of the Joint Center.
I think the Joint Center does a couple of things really well. It allows people to understand the information, but it has done so in a rigorous way.
We look to the center for their critical analysis around how different policy and legislative proposals will impact Black people.
The Joint Center has been that liaison for us in many ways, having the convening power to really be able to operate as a liaison and to organize the information that organizers need. That data actually empowered us on the ground that really wanted to let voters know that what was important, what was at stake.
When the Joint Center calls, people come.
We have paid a lot of attention to the center's focus on the future of work, the impact of, economic and pandemic-related changes on African-American workers and communities.
We found in our initial study that 27% of African-Americans were concentrated in just 30 jobs at high risk to automation, right? It's actually very simple study in terms of comparing the automation of jobs to racial data in terms of who's in what job. But we want to move forward and we want to help folks leapfrog forward in terms of mobility, social and economic mobility.
We've actually partnered with the Joint Center on a number of events and conversations and activities as it relates to the future of work for Black communities, particularly as it relates to strengthening, scaling, and building Black businesses around this country. We think it's the most strategic and fastest way to address the racial wealth divide impacting our community.
The Lumina Foundation has provided a $750,000 grant to the Joint Center to help build this policy agenda for Black America around the future of learning and work. We see this as an initial investment in terms of a long-term relationship with the Joint Center in order to help close educational attainment gaps for African Americans.
The research and reports they did on the failure of members of Congress to hire racially diverse senior staff has been really important in catalyzing improvement in those numbers.
And we found that even though African Americans are about 13% of the US population, they were less than 1% of top staff. And just really tracking and lifting up the data has resulted in changes.
It's one of those things that if it's not brought to your attention, maybe it's not on your radar. And I think it's safe to say it's now on folks' radar.
With regard to the transition, we've got 45 Black organizations, and they are identifying strong, talented people to put forward. And as a result, we've collected 2,100 resumes so far, and we're working to try to make sure that these folks are prepped for interviews and ready to go in.
The instances where the problems and the solutions potentially match up so that you can actually make progress are rarer than people think. And we are at one of those moments now. And the Joint Center is one of the best positioned organizations to help take advantage of that. It's one of the premier think tanks and certainly the premier think tank around race issues in the United States.
I am so grateful to the sponsors of the organization the corporations, the foundations that have had faith in us and who have continued to support us.
We're humbled by the fact that we're able to do this work on a day-to-day basis. Thanks for being a part of what we're trying to build and what we're trying to give to Black communities in the form of America's Black think tank.
50 years is an anniversary that's of great significance, and I would like to say that I, like many others, are grateful for the work that the Joint Center has done and look forward to its future contributions.
55 years ago, when we had the Voting Rights Act and the voting rights that came from the voting rights movement. And so you were right on the edge on 50 years ago. Like immediately the Joint Center came in existence and responded to the needs of our people. And you continue to stand there and be there for us. And I am just really, really honored to know the people who have been a part of this. And I'm looking forward for us to continue to move our communities forward.
Congresswoman Bass, thank you so much for joining us to celebrate the Joint Center's 50th anniversary and really think about the future and, you know, our purpose in the future and how we serve Black communities. We appreciate you. Just opening it up, you know, could you tell us a little bit about your background in community organizing, in the California Assembly, and also as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus?
Sure. Well, first of all, Spencer, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this, and congratulations on the 50th anniversary. You know, the center started just a little bit before the Congressional Black Caucus, so this is our 49th anniversary, and next year we celebrate our 50th. But, you know, when I think of community organizing and how I started, like so many people during that time period in the 70s, where there was grassroots activism, because we didn't really have organizations to address community problems such as police brutality, which was one of the first issues that I got involved in the community, or student organizing. And some basic principles of community organizing is that if you want to bring about change, especially for issues that impact low-income people, because we don't have millions of dollars to spend on lobbyists, you organize the grassroots, and it's about power. And so if you identify an issue that's a problem in the community, you go to the people who are the most affected to develop a solution. And so in the 1980s, when the crack cocaine crisis hit, and it was the intersection between the drug crisis, economic crisis, gang violence crisis, all intersected in South Central Los Angeles. In 1 year, we had over 1,000 homicides, and the community and the policymakers didn't know what to do. So a number of us who had been activists on issues for many, many years before then were very concerned that the only response policymakers had was to criminalize what we felt was a health issue, addiction, a social issue, gang problems, and then gang violence, which we saw as an economic issue because it involved drug trafficking after so many jobs disappeared with the ending of heavy industry in the South Central LA area. So I and some other activists formed a community organization, and we spent the first few months going door to door, talking to people in the neighborhood that was most impacted about drugs, asking them how they saw the problem, what was the solution. We organized them then to go to policymakers to pressure in one area or another. help us resolve the issue of crime by addressing the root causes of crime, and don't move to incarcerate people. Now everybody understands it.
Right.
But we saw in the 80s, it was obvious it was going to lead to mass incarceration, and we were trying to prevent it. Obviously, we didn't. Now, a couple of decades later, we understand this was not the solution.
Mm-hmm. And so as you think about that organizing back then, and then, we'll get in the California Assembly in a moment. If you think about organizing back then, so I think, Joint Center started in the 1970s. You're talking about California in the 80s, and then you founded Community Coalition in around 1990, somewhere in there. And so how has policy advocacy and organizing kind of evolved over that time since, the 70s through really today? I mean, the 5 decades there.
Well, it's changed dramatically. As a matter of fact, I was just celebrating this after the last election in California, because one of the ways mass incarceration started was passing horrible laws like 3 strikes. Mm-hmm. And during those years, we fought the passage of those laws, but we failed. Now, fast forward 3 decades, we have the capacity to put our own laws on the ballot. So if you ask me what has changed over the last 3 decades, we have tremendous capacity and positioning now that we did not have then. Organizing has professionalized. You have social justice organizations that are solid nonprofits that pay decent wages, because in the past, people that did this work had to take a vow of poverty. Right. And now we have the structures, the infrastructures in place around the country. We also have a number of activists who've moved into positions of authority and power, whether that's elected office or appointed office. And so we're in a much stronger position today than we were then. And then just on the research side, I think society understands. I mean, we're going through another drug epidemic right now. It's opioids. Now it's impacting a different population, primarily white, or at least it's reported that way. Nobody's talking about locking everybody up. Everybody's understanding now that addiction is a health issue and not an issue of crime. And so I think things have changed dramatically. Now, we had a huge setback over the last 4 years with President Trump, but now we can look forward to a new administration and a new day and hopefully get our nation and our communities back on track.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Joint Center, you remember, was originally founded in 1970 to help those people who were kind of moving from being activists mm-hmm. to being Black elected officials. I mean, it was right after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, 5 years after is when it was founded. And so, you had your transition in terms of becoming a member of the assembly and kind of moving from community activists to, kind of being inside the state legislature. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience and, what you eventually achieved in that role?
Sure. But let me also just say, when you ask, what has changed over the last 3 decades, the need for the Joint Center is even much greater now mm-hmm. because there was a few elected officials back then. Now we number in the thousands. And if you add in the social justice grassroots organization, it expands the role and the need for the Joint Center. But in terms of my transition from full-time activist into elected official, that was a strategic decision that I thought long and hard about, because I never imagined myself running for office. But what happened was I really wanted to start an organization, build it, recruit the leadership, and leave. Because one of the things that happens in our community, and it's not just the Black community, but people who are the founders of organizations have a really hard time leaving. And I think, because I believe, and it was certainly proved over these last 4 years, the struggle for social and economic justice never ends.
Right.
I mean, maybe before 2016, we thought that if you won something, that was it. But now we know that you can have an administration come in and tear apart the things that you won and that you fought for. And so you have to view the struggle for social and economic justice as an ongoing struggle. So it was important for me to leave. They didn't need me anymore because we had trained the leadership. And now I could go into a different level. As far as I'm concerned, the struggle is the same. The location where that struggle takes place is different. And I was recruited to run because during the time there were no Black women in the state legislature. Because of term limits, everybody had termed out. And as a matter of fact, most of them had come to Congress. And it wasn't like it was 10, it was more like 3. And so because there were no Black women, and what I realized, Spencer, was I could go to the State House and work on the very same issues that I was working on in the community. And that's what did it for me. As long as I could stay focused on the same issues, and by the way, I stay focused on the same issues in Congress. Mm-hmm. And so it's just another forum, another arena for the same struggle that I was involved in when I was walking the streets of South Central LA, interviewing residents about drugs.
And you became the Speaker of the Assembly while you were there. Is that right?
Yes. I was the Speaker in the last 2 years because we had very, very short term limits. And unfortunately, I was the Speaker when the economy was collapsing. And you know, California was the 5th largest economy in the world. And we moved from the 5th to the 8th. We had a $40 billion deficit. And it was very devastating because the very reason I went to Sacramento, I wanted to expand and strengthen programs. Those very programs I had to lead devastating cuts. But we fought for cuts versus dismantling programs, which some forces wanted to do. The state recovered and those programs were refunded. Mm-hmm.
So now you come to Congress, you're active, you have been the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus for a couple of years here. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Sure. Well, it's just the greatest honor to chair the Congressional Black Caucus over these last 2 years when we had 55 members and 5 of our members chaired full committees, we call them Big Five, and 28 of our members chaired subcommittees. So you're talking about the Congressional Black Caucus at the height of its power. Out of 228 Democrats, 55 were African American. Now, unfortunately, over the last 2 years that I've been chair, we lost 3 of our members, Elijah Cummings, John Conyers, and John Lewis. And so it was a year of wonderful advancements, but also tragedies. But look at how we're ending the year. A few weeks away from swearing in the second member of the Black Caucus to go to the White House. We have sent a president to the White House, and in a few weeks, we will send a vice president to the White House. And so it's a very exciting time as we prepare to enter our 50th anniversary.
Right. So now you are obviously aware of the Heritage Foundation and the role that it plays in terms of a think tank and, yes, you know, kind of some of your colleagues there and their relationship with it. And you know about the Bipartisan Policy Center and a variety of think tanks that are in DC. You know, as we continue to scale the Joint Center and work on, you know, serving Black elected officials, can you tell us, you know, what do you see as the role for the Joint Center in terms of serving Black elected officials at different levels, whether that's the CBC, whether that's on the state level? Tell us a little bit about what you see in terms of elected officials and supporting Black elected officials.
Well, I think it's absolutely critical because one of the things that most people might not realize is that when you run for office and when you're in office, you sure better have a specific agenda. Because if you don't, the whirlwind of a legislative body, whether it's local, state, or federal, will consume you. And if your original reason for running was to improve the quality of life of Black people, if you don't have a strong agenda, then that can get lost very easily. And that's where the Joint Center can come into play. Because a lot of people might get elected to office, but you know, nobody really teaches you once you get elected what to do. And so you might have the best policy dreams in the world, but the Joint Center, I think, can play a critical role. I mean, in Congress, you know, we do have resources here, but, you know, many elected officials around the country don't. And the other thing, too, that I think that the Joint Center can do now that is so critical is link up the social justice organizations, the Black leaders that are positioned, that are not elected, that are appointed, and bridge the gap. Because since most of my life was spent outside as an activist, one of my frustrations in being in office is that activists sometimes do not strategically use us. They use us. Like, for example, when I was speaker, I'd be in the State House sitting there. Now, that's the catbird seat for power, right?
Right.
And I open my doors and people would be having congressional visits where they could have picked up the phone and called me and said, who should we meet with? What should we be talking about? I could help them. And so the Joint Center could play that intermediary role in helping organizations, both grassroots and appointed leaders, understand how to link up, how to strategically use the power that is there in their community. And the research, the policy papers, the analysis, not everybody has access to it. And so we have access to that kind of research here, but not from a Black perspective. It's generic. And we need the specificity.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's helpful, especially coming from you, and to hear you say it. There is, I think, a renewed commitment to community grassroots organizing and the importance of it. We've seen the movements with regard to some of the police violence. And kind of the community organizing, certainly people using social media on the local level to come together. What's the role? We definitely value our connection to the Congressional Black Caucus, but, we also really want to be very connected to community organizations because, we see ourselves as part of a larger movement and just one actor in an ecosystem of important actors. And so, what's our role with regard to, do you think, with regard to community organizations and how we can support them and how we can help them and add value to them and their work?
Well, I think you can help the community organizations be the bridge. I mean, the Joint Center can be the bridge, rather, with community organizations. The wealth of research and information that you have. Again, community organizations are operating at different levels of capacity, and you could play a tremendous role in sharing your knowledge and your relationships. I would say those two things, the knowledge and the relationships, is what the community-based organizations could really use. How to connect up with elected officials, how to use the power that's already there in the community. Oftentimes, I have found over the years that communities always are very clear about what they don't have, but sometimes they're not clear about what they actually have, the resources that are there, how to strategically use them. And I think that that's a role that the Joint Center could play. And then also with philanthropy, because, many social justice organizations don't have access to philanthropic dollars. They might be funded, in different ways, small donations. And philanthropic communities now are acknowledging the Black community again. There was probably a decade and a half or so that we were out of fashion. And it seemed to some philanthropic organizations that other folks of color were of more significance. I think the whole Black Lives Matter movement, the whole question of systemic racism and what has happened this summer, there is a renewed awareness and a new significance placed on Black leadership. And I do think that the role that you can play in developing Black leaders who might be in positions of power and might be new. Again, I'll repeat what I said a few minutes ago. When you get elected to office, nobody sits you down and says, now I'm going to train you to be an elected official. Now, what happens on the congressional level and on a state level is that you go through these mass orientations, but you're so disoriented. Whether you remember what happened in your orientation, is news, but nobody follows up with you to say, let me take you to elected official school. And so, you immediately get thrown into the deep end of the pool. and you start swimming or drowning, one or the other. And so that's why I was saying it's so important to come in with a clear agenda. Another role that the Joint Center can play is helping people develop their policy agenda and how to actually make a difference. Because it's great to come in and say, I'm going to pass a bill calling for world peace. Doesn't really help anybody. We don't see world peace. But what can I do concretely? And I think that that's, again, another area that the Joint Center can play.
So now you have seen a number of things evolve and change, but I would imagine you've seen a lot of problems that persist, right? And so as you think about, the challenges and the opportunities for Black communities over the next decade or two, what are you seeing? What are you thinking about here in terms of the challenges and opportunities facing Black communities over the next couple of decades?
Well, unfortunately, for the next few years, we don't really have a choice. It has been imposed on us, and it's called COVID. Mm-hmm. I think that the impact is massive. I think that we will learn over time how many of the 260,000 people were Black who died. Of the 11 million people that were infected, what is the demographic breakdown? This administration has resisted data because this administration has resisted science. And so there's a lot of unknowns. And I think that we need to know the impact, the health, the social, the economic impacts of COVID. So for a while, we're going to be in a defensive posture because it has been devastating in a health, in a social, and an economic way. And let me give you one example. The achievement gap. Before COVID, we had a massive achievement gap. What do you think it's going to be now? Next year, this time, when a number of our kids, if not the majority, have lost an entire calendar year in school. That achievement gap is going to be massive. And so we need to, which is why I'm excited, the next administration is talking about building America back better. We can't just go back to the status quo. We're going to need to have a Marshall Plan or something around education. And then through the pandemic, America discovered something it didn't know, which is Black people have underlying health conditions and there are health disparities. So we need to address those as we move forward. Why is it that there's disproportionate rates of hypertension and stroke and heart disease and cancer in the Black population? And then, of course, we know that it is impacting us in a disproportionate manner. So I think the consequences of COVID are going to dictate our agenda. The wealth that was lost in the last recession, we hadn't recovered from that. And now the economic impact of the pandemic is continuing. We're still in the middle of it. And we know in the next couple of months, if it actually has started in some areas, that Black people are going to face massive evictions where people are just going to be thrown in the street. Now in Los Angeles, where I represent, on any given night in Los Angeles County, there are 60,000 people sleeping in the streets. And a very disproportionate percentage of those are Black relative to the population in Los Angeles. So the social, health, and economic problems we faced before COVID have just been magnified, and that is going to define our agenda for the next few years. Mm-hmm. Oh, by the way, let me just another thing. The fact that the people in the United States are articulating the phrase systemic racism, there was a huge advancement. We've seen a number of Black people murdered on video, but usually no one connected it up with systemic issues, even though Black people have been screaming this for generations. So now that there is this new awareness, we need to maximize that. New awareness of systemic racism, a new administration, and one thing that the next administration could do, and this is another role of the Joint Center to me, is an audit of each of the federal agencies to see where is their institutional discrimination. And you just take federal contracts, for example, and you know that. I mean, those are all geared toward people who have a lot of money. So can we address some of the systemic issues when we put the Health and Human Services Agency back together, the Department of Education, the Environmental Protection Agency. How do we address the inequities and the systemic racism that policies either encourage, explicit, implicit, in those federal agencies, and then the dismantling of safety net and safeguards from the Trump administration need to be put back in place in the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm. So, you have built institutions and certainly an important community organization. I assume that obviously a large part of that is you, but I assume that a part of that is you developing other people.
Yeah.
Just as you kind of counsel me here, and I think about the next 10 or 15 years in terms of the Joint Center, kind of what advice do you have for me in terms of building strong Black institution that's well run, people who are productive and who are growing, kind of, what are your insights or thoughts for me with regard to that?
Well, first of all, I think we counsel each other. You play a very important role, as you did in our emergency summit, when we were looking for some of the examples of systemic racism. But I think that, a closer working relationship is very important in terms of with the Congressional Black Caucus, and maybe going over specific areas of policy where we can work together jointly. These are things we've always done, but I think that the need for it is even more important now, and making our collaboration now with the White House. And I'm looking at a number of people that the president has already appointed, and I think that our contact communication is going to be so much stronger. And so when we see the appointments, the key appointments that are done, might be good for us to sit back and develop a little strategic plan as to who we go after, when we, how we work with them. That's what I mean by going after. We want to reach out to them and we want to say, let's sit down and talk about the specific areas in your agency that need to be addressed. We want to know what has gone on over the last 4 years, because I have a feeling that there's an awful lot broken in each of these departments and agencies. The other thing, too, is that, we need to have a plan over the political education and development of our folks. I'm looking at some of the new members coming in, who come in with, as all new members do, very excited, big ideals, want to make big changes. But again, there's nobody there to say, come here, let me show you the way. I mean, we do it informally. But, it might be something that the Joint Center puts on. There might be some specific policy seminars that you put on that we can direct our new members to.
So, I am definitely an advocate of you focus on something, get it down, and then you move out, as opposed to trying to take on too much at once, right? So, there are a lot of problems we need to get down. But as Black folks, as the Joint Center, just generally, right? I think a question I have for you is, and this is related to the Joint Center, but it's also related to Black folks, is what is the role of Black communities in the U.S. relative to the diaspora? I know that you have focused a lot on foreign affairs issues, and you're well versed in them. And what's the role of the Joint Center? What's the role of Black folks in the U.S.? We've kind of got our own issues and challenges that we're dealing with. What's the role of us relative to folks who are in the Caribbean, folks who are in Africa, Black folks who are in Europe? What's the relationship? What's our role?
Well, and again, I might be making suggestions of things that the Joint Center is already doing. But, there might be, there is a need for some curriculum development. Again, I'm thinking about those new elected officials. I'm thinking about our new members. There might be, since we know it doesn't take place, it might be great to talk about being an elected official or a leader with some very specific curriculum and seminars and all. And I think the same thing is needed in the community, because sometimes Black communities, it just depends on where you are. If you're in New York, you're used to the diaspora from everywhere.
Right.
But depending on where you're from, you're not. But I think that the Joint Center could play a wonderful role in educating people. For example, a lot of African Americans don't realize that when the transatlantic slave trade was taking place, that there were far more Africans in the tune of millions that were dropped in Latin America.
Right.
And so there are far more Black people south of the border of the United States than there are in the United States. And then if we want to see the Black population grow in the United States, it's going to be through immigration.
Right.
It's not going to be through birth rate. If you look at California, California is 40 million people, 40% Latino. It's not because Mexican Americans had millions of babies. It's because of immigration. And so we need to welcome Black immigrants. We need to understand their historical origins. So, for example, Black people coming from Brazil or from Central America, completely different than Black folks that come from Africa, because, you know, African immigrants are some of the most, and in different years, the most educated immigrants of any group.
Right. Nigeria. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Including, and people would offer that stereotype to Asians or to Europeans, but
Right.
African immigrants are some of the most educated. But that's a completely different circumstance than an immigrant from Jamaica, Haiti, or Belize.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there's education that needs to take place amongst Black people, because one of the things that we don't need to do is to judge who's Black and who isn't. Mm-hmm. Oh, you don't speak English? Well, you're not Black. Well, you know. So I do think that the Joint Center could put on seminars that talk about the diaspora and talk about the relationship between, you know, the transatlantic slave trade. We are descendants from enslaved individuals from all over the Americas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as you think about, you know, just kind of last thoughts from me, big things that you think I should focus on. It's so easy, as you know, to kind of get caught up in the weeds and kind of the day-to-day tasks and lists. But, you know, just in terms of stepping back and keeping my eye on the ball as the leader of the Joint Center and our eyes as a team at the Joint Center on the ball, what are the, you know, any kind of parting or last thoughts that you have for us in terms of big things that we should just focus on and concentrate on and not get distracted from by smaller things?
I'll think about that for a second, but before I respond to that, I mean, I do think one thing that the Joint Center could do a little more of is a PR campaign. Mm-hmm. A PR campaign around what the Joint Center does, who the Joint Center is, how to connect. Because I think if you're far on the outside, I mean, if you're in DC, that's one thing.
Right.
But I think that's something that is really important.
And you know what's interesting about that comms piece is we looked at the history of the Joint Center. In its founding, Louis Martin, who, you know, was a Black newspaper person, Chicago Defender, helped found the Michigan Chronicle. Eddie Williams, Black newspaper man, he was the vice president of communications at the University of Chicago. You know, that was a heyday. And then, you know, the Joint Center slipped a bit in the 1990s when it didn't get online and kind of didn't. So this communications piece is so important. Looking back at the strengths and the successes of the Joint Center and some of the areas for growth or shortcomings, you know, the communications, strong communications were key when things were going well. And so I completely hear you on that, and I'm committed to that. So that's wonderful point, in part in terms of PR and brand, but also just learning, exchange, kind of understanding the current communications network and infrastructure and being able to interact and play in it. Yeah, research is important. Numbers are important, definitely. But we got to get the comms piece down. You're
Well,
absolutely
exactly,
right.
because people won't know about the research or the data.
Right,
You
right,
know?
absolutely.
But also something that we never had to deal with before as a community, or as a planet actually, is that now you have to have multiple layers of a communication strategy that communicate to each generation.
Right.
And then it also has to be creative. It can't just be a memo or a document. You got to dance. You got to, whatever. But you have communication involves entertainment as well, depending on the generation. You can communicate to older generations in a more traditional manner, but younger generations, that's a whole different thing. So I think that would be really key, because you can't do the other things without massive communication. The elected officials, I think about the state of Mississippi, for example, in Benny Thompson's district. In Benny Thompson's district, I don't remember exactly what the number is, so I'll make a number up to make my point. I think he has like 20 Black mayors. It actually might be a lot more than that. 20 Black mayors. And each of the towns are really, really small. And so when I think of Black elected officials, I'm thinking of the gamut from mayors of big cities like Keisha Bottoms in Atlanta, or the mayors in Benny Thompson's district. So it's that. But then also, maybe the Joint Center could really take ownership of systemic racism in terms of break that down. It's not a hashtag. It's not a phrase. What does systemic racism mean, and how can we concretely address it? One of my pet peeves is that as a nation, we don't know how to talk about race. Now, we all know that. But given that Black people are born with this responsibility of teaching everybody about racism, one of my pet peeves is that people only want to talk about racism about individual attitudes. Forget individual attitudes. It's institutional racism that is significant. And it's the power that racism brings. And so being able to break that down makes it manageable. This is something we can deal with, and it takes the guilt away. And I think Black people need to be better at talking about the institutional side of it, as opposed to focusing on microaggressions or people's behavior, because while we're worried about microaggressions, which all of us, no one likes that, okay?
Right.
But it's housing policy.
Right.
It's environmental policy.
Yeah.
It's these things.
Yeah. Institutions and systems,
Yes.
right? Definitely.
That needs to be the focus, and then that takes it away from guilt. The other fundamental one of the fundamental problems in our community that makes it so difficult, and our community suffers from it, is we've monetized poverty. So it's so hard to address poverty because people make so much money off of poverty. And incarceration. There was a lawsuit last year against the prison system in Arizona because their census went down, because the private prisons were mad. They weren't making enough money. Right. So that's another example, because who's in the prisons?
Right. Right. This whole profiting off of the poverty and the suffering of other people is a problem. And how do we take away those incentives? You talked about Mississippi. I think the Joint Center's last count, it's been a couple of years since we pulled this together. There were 10,000 Black elected officials in the country, and 1,000 of them were from Mississippi. Going to your very point here, right? Yeah. 1,000 of them were from Mississippi.
How many million people?
Very relatively small state, but as you know, it's about 38% African American. So, most significant percentage of African Americans in the country. And I think that, combined with the fact that you've got a lot of rural areas and some, small towns and counties, et cetera, a lot of Black elected officials in Mississippi. So we certainly want to support them.
So a lot of Black elected officials with how much power in terms of the, Mississippi's power structure? Is it the mayors that have the power? Is it the counties where they're not Black elected officials? I'm just raising the question. They might be on the county level too. But yes, how to utilize, we're all privileged when we have these positions. And it's just unconscionable to me that we would misuse, abuse, waste the power and the position that we have. We should be devoted to improving our community 100%. as opposed to viewing elected office as something I've achieved as an individual to advance myself or my career.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it's probably not just elected officials who should have that attitude, right? But many of us who serve other folks in whatever we do. So, Madam Chair, I really just appreciate your time. You've been a great supporter in the past. Appreciate your friendship during your tenure and working with you. I look forward to working with you in the future, and we just appreciate your many contributions and your leadership in our community.
Well, thank you. And likewise, absolutely appreciate your work. And since you've been there at the Joint Center, you have absolutely elevated it. And anything that I can do to help you continue to do that, I'm here.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
It is my pleasure to announce the recipient of the Joint Center's Great American Award for 2020. This award is named in honor of Louis E. Martin, a principal founder of the Joint Center and the first chairman of its Board of Governors. Martin's contributions to the political empowerment of African Americans is undeniable, and his political prominence influenced some of the most historical presidential decisions regarding African Americans in the late 20th century. His career as a presidential advisor began in 1960 when he was recruited to work on the presidential campaign of John F. Kennedy. In the same year, Martin was pivotal in advising Kennedy to contact Coretta Scott King to express his grievance over her husband, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., being arrested at a sit-in protest in Atlanta. This moment was instrumental in Kennedy gaining the majority of the black vote in 1960's presidential election. After Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Martin was one of the few advisors that transitioned to the Johnson administration, and it was during Johnson's presidency that Martin was influential in the president's decision to nominate Thurgood Marshall as the first African American to serve as a justice on the United States Supreme Court. Mr. Martin was also a leader in the black press. He served as the editor of the Michigan Chronicle and helped found the National Newspaper Publishers Association. Among friends and colleagues, Louis E. Martin was known for expressing his warmest respects with his favorite compliment, "You are a great American." And past recipients of this award include Tom Perez, past Joint Center President Eddie Williams, Senator Cory Booker, Ambassador Susan Rice, Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reed, Congressman John Lewis, Reverend Jesse L. Jackson Sr., Dr. Dorothy Height, Congressman Jim Clyburn, Congressman Charles Rangel, President Bill Clinton, Muhammad Ali, Vernon Jordan, and President Jimmy Carter. It is our pleasure to give the 2020 Louis E. Martin Great American Award to Representative Cedric Richmond. Cedric Richmond has served as representative for Louisiana's 2nd Congressional District since 2011. He was chair of the Congressional Black Caucus from 2017 to 2019. He's the only Louisiana Democrat serving in either chamber of Congress. He served as state representative from New Orleans to the Louisiana State House from 2000 to 2011. In 2019, he was named the first national co-chairman of the Joe Biden 2020 presidential campaign. And just a few weeks ago, Mr. Richmond announced that he would leave Congress in January 2021 to serve as a senior advisor to the president and will serve as the head of the White House Office of Public Engagement. This role will be critical for the future of Black America. Mr. Richmond?
To Chairwoman Barbara Johnson, to Spencer Overton, the board and staff of the Joint Center, and our friends at the Raven Group, it is my distinct honor to receive this year's Lewis E. Martin Great American Award. Mr. Martin's legacy and career was so pivotal in earmarking the success of thousands of Black elected officials, including my own. I owe him a deep seat of gratitude. His work in advocating and advancing landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, provided a blueprint for those of us in the conscience of Congress to build upon and advance. As a former chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus and outgoing chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, I have always valued and applauded the work of the Joint Center in alignment with our strategic goals. From Mr. Martin's time and leadership through today, you have exhibited a steadfast commitment to training, informing, and developing Black political talent to ensure that we have a seat at the most important tables there are. What I admire most about Mr. Martin is his wisdom, longevity, and commitment in building bipartisan relationships and indelible influence that has appropriately named him the Godfather of Black politics. Receiving this award is equally humbling and inspiring for me. As I make the transition from the U.S. House of Representatives to the White House, this serves as a necessary reminder of how much work we still have to do. Many of us elected officials know well that service is the rent we pay for living on earth, and that we also carry unique responsibilities of both service and leadership to our smaller communities, broader nation, and world stage. I will keep this token of appreciation and dedication near to me as a reminder of the strides of our past and the endeavoring duties of our future. When I think of what it means to be a great American, I think of our ancestors, what it means to sacrifice, show courage under fire, lead with compassion, and sow bonds and friendships where one may least expect them. Thank you so much for considering me a great American and awarding me with this great honor. I am making a promise to you to always uphold the values of Mr. Martin and the Joint Center for many years to come. Thank you again.
I am Barbara Johnson, Chair of the Board of Governors of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. I'd like to thank everyone for their support of the Joint Center and this event. In particular, I would like to recognize a number of people whose support and dedication made this event possible. First, our fabulous and committed Board of Governors, Robert Rabin, Secretary, Robert Higgins, Treasurer, Spencer Overton, President of the Joint Center, and A. Scott Bolden, Paula Boyd, Chanel Hardy, Kenneth Jones, Dr. Diane Penderhughes, Carla Thompson Payton, Paul Thornell, and Antonio Williams. I'd like to thank our host committee for this event: Paul Braithwaite, Roz Brooks, Ellen Blair Chube, Fabrice Coles, Satanya Fair, Isaac Forjor, Adam Hodge, Fred Humphreys, Maria Kirby, Ashley Lewis, Marcus Sebastian Mason, Aaron Moore, Michelle Perceau, Michael Powell, Dante L. Smalls, Nigel Stevens, Kenny Thompson Jr., Dr. Gregory Vincent, Brandon Webb, Hillary West, and Sherry Wilson, and our generous sponsors, including chair-level sponsors, the BOULE Foundation and Comcast NBC Universal, and member-level sponsors, MasterCard, Microsoft, the Rockefeller Foundation, and T-Mobile. We are overwhelmed by the amount of support for this event and thank everyone who made it possible. You can learn more and can continue to support the Joint Center at www.jointcenter.org. Thank you again for joining us over these three days. 50 years is a long time for an institution to survive and remain relevant. And as Juan Williams said in his book about the Joint Center, written in connection with our 25th anniversary, To grasp the Joint Center's significance in America and the world, it is necessary to go beyond the calendar and tap into the centuries-old idea of equality and the years of toil and hope that are the story of Black American freedom and struggle. In this context, the Joint Center takes on a sharper identity. It is part of something much older, an arc of justice that spans the nation's history. It is the heir to a rich legacy of activists and scholars, from the early abolitionists to the civil rights leaders of the 60s, and I will add, to those advocates for Black Lives Matters today. Because although there has been progress with increasing the political and economic power of Blacks in this country, so much work remains to be done before true equality, true freedom is realized. 2020 is our 50th anniversary, and this year has highlighted in many ways the magnitude of the inequities that continue to exist when it comes to Black communities in this country. Yet we look to the future with hope. Why? Because, as James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And perhaps this country is starting to come to terms with, to face, its history of racism. So we are hopeful for what the future holds and look ahead with confidence that the Joint Center will play a major role in helping to shape a better tomorrow. We are so grateful for what you've done to make our 50th anniversary celebration a great success. Thank you for being our partner on this journey toward a brighter tomorrow and greater political and economic power for Blacks in this country. Thank you.